All right, then I think we can get started. So once again, good morning to our audience and welcome to this EUISS event under the title Europe on its own, Navigating a Future Without America. My name is Giuseppe Spatafora. I am the analyst for transatlantic relations at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, and I'm joined by a few esteemed colleagues that I will introduce in a second to talk and reflect on the unprecedented events of the past few weeks, and in particular, these unraveling of the transatlantic relationship, something really unprecedented. We know how President Trump has openly humiliated President Zelensky, blocked support and intelligence sharing to Ukraine until last night, and opened channels with Russia. And at the same time, this administration has started changing the US posture in Europe and with Russia, questioning the US commitments to Europe, and at the same time also attacking Europe on certain issues such as trade, technology controls, freedom of speech. So it's really a new, complete set of issues that we have to deal with. And this has opened questions that we may have never asked or asked just ran, as a thought experiment in the past. Is the US still an ally of Europe? Or has Washington become even an adversary in some areas? How can the Europeans defend themselves and continue supporting Ukraine without the US? And importantly, what are the urgent actions that the European Union and its member states must take to address these challenges? Now, important questions, essentials for the day. And I'm joined to discuss these issues by our director, Stephen Everts, and by Andrei Dietrich, who's a senior analyst for Russian EU Eastern Neighborhood, and Clotilde Beaumont, who's our senior analyst for cyber and digital issues. Just before we get started, just to give you an idea of our playbook, we will speak, each of us, for about 5 minutes or a little more, and that should give us a good 30 minutes or up to 20 for questions at the end. So please start thinking about questions even as we speak. Feel free to use the chat on LinkedIn to write your questions, and then we'll try to answer them to the best of our abilities, and we will conclude sharply at 11 o'clock. So let's dive into it, and I would like to start with our director, Stephen Everts, who's really going to talk about the scale of the issues. What are the challenges that we face? And is Europe starting to work on it? Are we ready to take serious action? What have we done recently? What do we need to do next? Please, Stephen.
Well, many thanks, Giuseppe, and it's really good to be with the colleagues to discuss, as you say, this radically transformed international landscape that we're now confronted with. So let me dive right in and say a few points on what is happening and what Europe should do now. Now, on the first point, on the diagnosis, I mean, the first starting point has to be that we should have no illusions. Remember, a couple of months ago, many people were talking about Trump-proofing, different policy areas, and we were ready for increased tariffs. And actually, this morning, you've seen that the European Commission is announcing countermeasures. We were ready for pressure on increasing European defense spending, and the playbook was set for that. But what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is something quite different. It's almost like a sort of a cultural revolution that is unfolding in Washington today, which involves a much deeper, more dramatic and radical rethinking of America's global posture. And you've already alluded to some of the dramatic decisions that we've seen with, threats of the territorial integrity of allies, abandonment of long-term security partners, an alignment with far-right radical forces inside Europe, which have, huge destabilizing effects. And it's quite astonishing, a vote in the UN Security Council, which saw the United States line up with Russia and with China. This is unprecedented. So we should have no illusions about the scale of the changes that are happening. And it's interesting, I find that whilst political leaders that go to the White House from our side are still quite polite and, trying to maintain working relationships, I mean, at the level of public opinion, the shift is really already happening quite dramatically. I saw a poll the other day which saw that trust in Germany, a bulwark of close transatlantic partnership, trust in the United States had dropped from 84% to 16% in a matter of 2 weeks, which 16% was just above 6% for Russia. So this gives you a sense that people in Europe are realizing that America first really has harmful consequences for them. Now, what to do? This is what I think the topic is for our meeting. My first overall point is, let's focus more on ourselves than on constantly interpreting and following the latest outrages in Washington. Focus on Europe. Focus above all on European strength, investing in our own strength in all its dimensions. Because there's one thing that we've learned of the sort of hyper-competitive world today, is that only if you're strong can you remain free. Only if you're strong will you remain master of your own choices and your own future. Now, a bit more, some comments on sort of the three headline issues on Ukraine, on European defense, and let's say the wider world. I'll go quick because the colleagues are also going to come in on that. Now, on Ukraine, we know the needs of Ukraine, and we've seen at a minimum enormous question marks and an instrumentalization of US military support and intelligence support. They turn it off, they turn it on, they turn it off. I mean, Ukraine can no longer rely on American military support in the way that has been the case previously. And we know that they need air defense. We know that they need satellite and other communications assets, given also the vulnerability around Starlink. And we know they need more training, because the brutal reality is that the war is not going as well as it should. And one reason for that is insufficient training. Not the sole reason, but it's an important reason. And I think in each of these areas, air defense, missile defense, satellite and communications, and training, there are European options that exist, and they need to be scaled up and they need to be deployed rapidly. On the negotiations, latest news is that there is an agreement in the US and Ukraine on a potential 30-day ceasefire. My only comment right now, Andre will develop more, is to be very wary of where this is going. I think the most likely scenario is we're going to have simultaneously ups and downs in negotiations whilst the war is going on, because Putin is not interested in a sustainable peace. He's interested in the subjugation of Ukraine. So let's be very careful on that. And finally, on this issue of frozen assets, which is always in the debate when you talk about Ukraine, I think the moment has now come where Europeans have to sort of bite that bullet. There are 200 billion frozen assets held in Europe, and given everything else that's going on, I think it is right and proper that we now seize these assets and make them available, but on one clear condition: that the money is only used to buy Ukrainian arms, for Ukraine to buy its own developed arms industry at home, as well as reconstruction of the part of Ukraine that's not occupied, or European arms. Now, on this question of European armament, you have written and others have written about it, and you say something more in a moment. The way I interpret the debate today is that the money issue is developing. I mean, every day you hear new announcements at national level, at EU level. Germany, 500 billion, rearm Europe is the latest initiative by the European Commission. I think the rate of return per hour spent is now greater on looking at how to spend this money, how to spend these vast sums of money that are now becoming available, and what to spend it on. And I think we need to rapidly agree on a few flagship projects where we can also demonstrate that spending at EU level is also better spending. And there are areas, again, in missile defense and communications and strategic enablers, as the jargon has it, where no single European country can acquire these, and where the added value of spending European is the greatest. And one other thing on European defense, and away from money and industry and all of that, there's one issue that bothers me a lot, and that we are already in a war, in a state of war with Russia of some form. Maybe it's a shadow war, it's a hybrid war, or call it what you like. But Russia is attacking European countries and European interests every day. And our response to that is relatively cautious. And the magic word for that debate is resilience. You know what you need to do? You need to strengthen resilience. And of course you should. But my argument is you also need to increase the cost of the Kremlin of pursuing this kind of hybrid war against us. Because at the moment, the strategic initiative is all on his side. He decides where the next attack takes place, and then we should be more resilient in dealing with it. maybe there's also room for a more proactive strategic posture in that field. And then lastly, there's a big wider world. We titled this Europe Alone, this event. And of course, I mean, there's a reason why in the transatlantic sense, we are sort of alone. We can discuss the degree of that. But in the wider sense, Europe is not alone. You know, we're under threat, but we're not alone. There are many countries in the world that are also, like us, scratching their heads and say, what on earth is going on in Washington? And what does all this mean for the international system, for trade, for security cooperation? And now is a perfect opportunity for us to get into a diversification agenda and to really work with partners in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, in Latin America. Mercosur agreement was finally agreed. Mexico rang us up and say, hello, Trump is coming. We're worried about this. Can we finally get the EU-Mexico agreement over the line? And so on and so forth. So there's a wide set of partners around the world that we should really intensify our cooperation with. One final comment. Let's be careful with the idea of a China option. In this debate, there are now people who say, well, there's all this turbulence between the Americans and the Europeans. What we need to do is get closer to the Chinese. My short version on that is, it's not because we have more difficulties with America that our long-standing difficulties with China have disappeared. So this idea of a China option, we need to be very careful about. Let me stop there and hand it back to you, Giuseppe.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Fantastic overview of the main issues and all the areas that we need to work on. It's really complex, but it is necessary. Now, all of us, the three analysts, we will delve on specific areas. Defense, myself, Ukraine for Andre, and technology digital issue for Clotilde. I will start briefly to discuss European defense and the threat or reality of US abandonment. I would like to build on a brief that we've published recently called the Trump card scenarios for US abandonment of Europe, which specifically deals with the issue of American security guarantees to European defense and commitment. And that those were scenarios, they are now becoming a reality very quickly and very soon. And I will discuss why. Now, just to clarify, when I talk about abandonment, I also mean retrenchment or end of US commitments to Europe. So this is the kind of theme that we are discussing. And it looks like there's a clear desire by the administration to reduce their commitment to Europe. But this type of reduction of commitment could still mean many things and could take different forms. And let me make an analogy with tariffs. Now, we know that Trump loves tariffs and he wants to implement tariffs as part of a permanent restructuring of the global economy to change the terms of trade, to benefits, in his mind, the American workers and so on. So in that case, the tariffs are a goal. But in another sense, tariffs are also tools to negotiate. And in fact, we've seen with Canada and Mexico, tariffs were put on, then removed, then put back on, then it looks like they're removed again to obtain concessions on certain issues. And it might be the case with us, with Europe, it might not be the case. The point is that tariffs are used in these two forms. And I believe that abandonment will also be used in these two forms. On the one hand, as a bargaining tool, and on the other one, as a policy goal. Let me expand a little more. So in the first sense, if abandonment is a bargaining tool, it means that the US wants to threaten to withdraw from Europe in exchange for something, to obtain something. So the US would pressure allies to do certain things, to change their policy by using the threat of withdrawal to obtain these concessions. And then the US would basically reward those allies who go in line with the demands and punish those who don't. It's a very transactional environment, but it's also an extractive environment as well. It's extractive in the sense that the US wants to get things out of Europe in exchange for not withdrawing. And in the sense, this seems in the first, at first sight, prima facie, this could look like a manageable scenario. Oh, we buy certain things from the US, we change our terms of trade, and then the US doesn't withdraw. Now, I'm afraid that, in fact, this could be a much worse scenario for a number of reasons. First of all, because this is almost a tactical engagement in which the US every time threatens withdrawal in exchange for things, but hasn't thought out the end goal. So it is using abandonment as a threat, but also it is not thinking about necessarily staying in Europe. So we don't know whether we can solve the problem. Second, this increases European dependencies on the US, on certain weapons, for instance, if we talk about defense. Now, it is not impossible to imagine that the US, just like with Ukraine, reduces weapon shipments to Europe or turns some weapons off. And the example of that is the F-35, a very complex fighter aircraft, which requires a lot of data integration, which is mostly provided by the US itself. This would also force Europeans to accept compromises in areas such as trade, such as technology control, such as China, and even in democracy and the way that we run our elections, in exchange for no abandonment. So that increases our dependencies. And third, this could also lead to the extreme bilateralization of relations, whereby each ally, each country, European country, deals directly with the US and not with the other countries. This would basically break up European unit, would basically break up NATO, and consequently, this could be even worse as a scenario. So let's not treat it as an easy transactional scenario that we can deal with. There's a second interpretation of abandonment, in which abandonment is the goal. So the US has the ultimate goal to withdraw its presence in Europe or significantly reduce it. So you see the difference analytically is significant. In the second case, the US wants to remove its presence from Europe. In the first case, it wants to use it as a tool. And that could mean the US forces normalization between Europe and Russia, removes its assets to go to other regions, maybe to deal with the Indo-Pacific or maybe to deal with other priorities. And importantly, the US defense industry could stop prioritizing weapon sales to Europe under directive from the Department of Defense, for instance, to move more assets and to sell more to Indo-Pacific partners or to the US mainland. So you see that this is something that is not new. We've heard it in Project 2025. We've heard it in the idea of a dormant NATO, in which the US commitment to Europe is limited to basically the nuclear umbrella. And it also is reflected in the speech that Secretary of Defense gave to NATO a few weeks ago. Now, this could be a fast withdrawal or a slow withdrawal, but the point is that it will be the goal. Okay, so just to conclude, both scenarios, I believe, are bad. They're both bad ways of abandonment. There's no better solution. Both are already happening, and I believe that there are certain elements of each. For instance, forcing Ukraine to sign the mineral deals, to go to the table, to make concessions to Russia in exchange for resuming aid, and forcing the Europeans to put some sort of backstop and security guarantees without US support is an indication of the first form of abandonment as a threat. But the reduction in US commitment to Europe, to NATO exercise, the change in its offensive cyber posturing towards Russia and others are indication of the second form of abandonment, of the desire to ultimately disengage from this theater. So this means that if both are happening, we need a solution that can take care of both issues. And frankly, we can discuss this in the Q&A, but bottom line up front is that we need a strong European deterrence force. It would help with both scenarios. In the first case, it would allow Europe to be in a stronger negotiating position with the US and being better able to reject bad deals. And in the second case, in the second scenario, it would help to defend Europe without America. And then we can discuss it further in the Q&A. There are multiple steps, some of which have already been mentioned by Stephen. But now it's important to move on to topics, and now we move on to Ukraine. So I'd like to ask Andre to speak. And, just to situate Andre's intervention, we've seen the intense US pressure that has gotten Ukraine to agree, at least at the beginning, on accepting some terms of a temporary ceasefire. Of course, so far, the question is whether Russia will go to the table. But basically, the question that I would like to ask you is, what are the prospects today for a ceasefire deal? What are the prospects for a good deal? What are the prospects for a bad deal? And what can the Europeans do to support Ukraine in advancing its requests and to get a better deal as opposed to a worse one? Andre.
Thank you, Giuseppe, and good morning to everyone. I think that sort of the starting point to address these questions is, and it sort of echoes what's been said before by Stephen in particular, that the order is rapidly fading, and we are looking at sort of hyper-accelerated US exit from hegemony. And we should not write off the US just yet, but we do need to adjust, get the diplomatic act together and support Ukraine defenses. Now, I think it's not so much about inventing new stuff, it's more about punching the warp speed button, if you like. So to your question, what the good deal for our time is, I think that question can be answered in several ways. In normative terms, it's a deal that paves the path to future just and sustainable peace. In process terms, it's a deal that Russia barely accepts and is unlikely to break because of disincentives put in place. And these disincentives would likely be a composite of strong Ukraine's defenses, the partners' security commitments, and risk reductions measures. So getting this deal was always going to be tough. There is what I'd say a threefold Russia problem: how to get Russia to the table, how to make it agree to the deal, and how to make it keep the deal. With Putin's objectives being liquidate Ukraine's sovereignty and erode Europe's security. And now Putin would be a fool not to believe that he has a good shot at his own version of a good deal with Trump. I think that neither Trump or Putin are driven primarily by ideology, but both see world politics in sort of fundamentally Hobbesian terms, and they have little respect for sovereignty of lesser states that lack the ability to coerce others or credibly threaten. So to get the good deal that we want and Ukrainians want, and I think we are very much aligned here, to get there, Russia needs to be pressured to seriously negotiate, to accept a deal that is not a capitulation for Ukraine, with neutrality, disarmament, leadership decapitation, basically, and to keep it for an extended period of time. Now, the obvious problem for Ukraine and the EU is that to build sort of a structure of incentives and disincentives for this to work, to have a shot at such a deal, without the United States, or potentially even with the US actively working against it. And we live at a moment of time where we need to seriously countenance this as at least a possibility. To get there, to build this structure without the US is nearly impossible. So what I think we should do, we need to increase immediately our military support to Ukraine. This includes new deliveries, more ammunition, more air defenses, more missiles. We can't do much on intelligence. The pause we saw was temporary. It was also partial. For the moment, it looks like the Ukrainians convinced the US that they are open to a ceasefire, and they successfully moved the ball to Putin's field. But what is disconcerting is that the US was willing to play this very sensitive card in the first place. And it could spell real trouble in the spring when the Ukrainians would like sort of the over the front line view ahead and during Russia's expected new offensive, assuming that there is no ceasefire by then. Second, I think we need to take immediate steps to invest in joint defense, industrial production, and maintenance. To support this, air defenses are vital, as always, as are war risk insurance mechanisms for European defense companies. I think rules really need to be relaxed. This is a time for making exceptions. Long-term contracts needs to be made. All that support for Ukraine is an investment in our own security, and we can actually learn a lot from Ukrainians for our own efforts to build up deterrence and defense posture. Difficult as it may be, I think we need to work with the Americans. Right? Sure, we need a good risk management strategy for any future security and defense cooperation, but on Ukraine and now the disincentive structure for a good deal is near impossible to piece together without at least some constructive US involvement. This applies to the pressure to get the deal and threatened credibly retribution if it's broken, including through massive economic sanctions. It applies to the backstop on potential reassurance force for Ukraine, for its own protection and for increased deterrence effect. By the way, I think this force would be very important for Ukrainians to reassure them. It could make a real difference. This is why Russians are so opposed to it. But I also think that we should not, fixate too much on it. I think it's really only a piece in a broader mosaic here. And by the way, we know that Americans are not opposed to deployment of this mission, though they are currently not prepared to provide the backstop. But can we really be sure that when the moment of truth arrives, the Trump administration will provide the enablers or even consent to using NATO infrastructure for command and control if Putin remains opposed? It's a real question. But we need to manage the risk to work with Americans, and we also need a sort of a separate incentive and disincentive structure to get them on board in the first place. The minerals deal was mentioned here. Ukraine needs to make it. Right? That's on them, right? But that I think also that the EU needs to play the defense procurement game. This will need some cold poker tactics, but ultimately, I think, as Mr. Trump likes to say, we have the cards. The US industry, with its stocks now plummeting, can have a stake in Europe's defense buildup or not, and all depends on how reliable it is. The reputational damage, it's done, right? And risks need to be carefully managed, but perhaps some trust can be restored over time. Conversely, if further steps are taken to undermine US credibility as a partner, it will be hard for Europeans to procure any critical weapon systems from them, F-35s, Patriots, you name it. And second, I think we need to sort of continue to be Greeks to the Romans, but we also need to be Greeks to the Persians. We need to sort of explain Russia, we need to explain Putin and the perils of unscripted deal-making with someone like him. We need to explain what kind of fantasy the reverse Nixon is, what a bad deal would mean, and that it would soon be broken. We need to explain the unintended consequences, that driving the bus down the cliff, will mean that it will hit the ground at some point. We need to also understand, I think, the spectacle quality of Trump politics and work with it. So, but we also need not to rely on lectures only and move on with our own defense integration, of course. And then the last point, there are numerous outstanding issues between Russia and the United States. There is no guarantee that these, great power talks will succeed. Now, as was mentioned, the ball is in Putin's court on the ceasefire, and Witkoff is headed to Moscow, is headed his way. Putin will surely not say no, but he will want stuff that would weaken Ukraine. And the question is where this will go then, and who will get blamed if it goes south. Given what the likely impact on these broad talks could be for Europe in terms of troops withdrawal, the abandonment that you are speaking and writing about, Giuseppe, sanctions suspension, it is clearly not in the Europeans' interest that these talks succeed. Should they fail or should they stall, it must be Putin who spoiled Trump's beautiful plans and took the Nobel Peace Prize away from him. And here I think it's important to understand, I'm getting to a close, that while Trump may believe in some sort of a grand bargain with Russians, also with the Chinese, the Kremlin is much more skeptical, but will, of course, opportunistically exploit Trump's unscripted peacemaking efforts that threaten to produce immediate costs for partners and allies, but also considerable future costs for the United States. So we should not write off Americans. We should not normalize, of course, blindly believe that promises and institutions will be respected and what seems impossible cannot happen. But we also can do some things, even in short term, on our own that increase pressure on Russia. I mentioned supporting Ukraine to make the continuation of aggression more costly and help Kiev achieve tactical successes. There have been cases of tactical counter-offensives in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. Recently, we are hearing, of course, about Kursk, and it's important there to prevent losses, right, as well. But also, making further tactical advances if possible. Ukraine has to have our backs to be in a position to reject a bad deal if necessary, and to keep fighting if necessary until conditions change. We should reinforce sanctions, focusing on oil as a key revenue source for Russia's war economy. This is where both the Baltic Sea comes to the fore. We need to know what to do, have a good legal case and communications, and deter or at least manage escalation risks there. And finally, we should, I believe, also concurring with Stephen, release at least a part of the frozen assets to Ukraine through perhaps some sort of dedicated sovereign Ukraine fund, with the rest potentially being used as a leverage against Russia breaking the future deal. And here I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre, for this dose of realism, pragmatism, but also relevance, of the key things that need to be done with the US or without the US. Now let's move to Clotilde, and we shift gear. We talk about technology and digital sovereignty issues. Obviously, we have seen an offensive by the new administration claiming that technology companies are victim of extortion, unfair practices, especially by the EU being singled out. And we've also seen the first speech that Vice President Vance gave on the European continent was at the EDII Paris summit, criticizing the EU for regulating AI companies and saying that the US won't stand for it, will develop AI on its own. So generally, we'd like to ask you, what else is the administration planning in this field? What are the risks for technological development and sovereignty in Europe?
Thank you, Giuseppe, and good morning, everyone. So the United States is indeed displaying overt hostility toward the EU and its member states, and the areas where Washington is most aggressive are defense, as we have just explained, but also, you mentioned it, Giuseppe, digital technologies, which are two sectors that the United States dominates and in which Europe remains highly dependent on its American ally. And the latest events have shown that digital technologies have become a means of leverage in a growing economic war. And I'm especially referring to Trump's coercive use of tariffs. We already mentioned them. And this has highlighted more than ever, and also that it is for security reasons, that the EU needs to reduce its dependencies on American digital companies, and in particular, big tech. And I think this is the path to follow, regardless of whether transatlantic relations worsen or improve. And so to jump back on your questions and maybe on the title of the panel, how can Europe step up and take control of its own future when it comes to digital technologies? And well, I see three main actions to achieve this goal. And so the first, and maybe the most immediate, is to resist American pressure. Because Trump's administration aims to maintain the American tech industry's dominant position in Europe and even expand further into the European market. And lately, this has led to increasingly strong threats to influence European legislation. Because regulations implemented by European institutions or individual member states are seen as obstacles to the competitiveness of American companies. And the primary targets of this aggressive stance are regulations concerning content moderation, as well as those imposing sanctions and taxes, such as the DSA, the Digital Services Act, the DMA, Digital Markets Act, the GDPR, or the most recent AI Act, along with certain national measures adopted by specifically Austria, France, Spain, and Italy. And to justify this stance, the United States relies on two main arguments. So on the one hand, it criticizes these regulations as being contrary to international trade laws, as undermining the free market, and as unfairly penalizing American companies. And in a memorandum released in late February, President Trump referred to these measures as, I quote, overseas extortion. And ironically, adopting European terminology, he accused them of threatening US security, US interests, and also US sovereignty. And on the other hand, the US challenges content moderation regulations, arguing that they violate freedom of expression and that they serve as a means of censorship and that they contradict core American values. And last September, no Vice President J.D. Vance went as far as suggesting that US participation in NATO could be reconsidered if the EU restricts free speech on US platforms. And so I think these elements show that the US has significant leverage over the EU to the European technological dependencies, and that it is determined to use it. But it also confirms that the EU must not give in this tug of war, because the US also has every interest in maintaining cooperation with Europe in the digital sector and ensuring the continuation of transatlantic data flows. And the European digital market is highly attractive to American companies, and loses access would result, well, A, in a substantial financial losses for them, and also B, in a strategic shortfall for the US in general. And this is likely why the Trump administration is not directly threatening to cut off access to certain digital services, which could be critical for the EU. And so this brings me to my second point, which is that EU must strengthen its digital industrial capabilities. And this has been a leitmotif of European digital policies for years now, both at the national and the regional levels. But as Andrei mentioned, it now needs to translate into concrete results. We need to press the speed button, as a solid European industrial ecosystem is crucial to prevent external coercion. And this is the first step towards building European digital sovereignty and strengthening the EU strategic autonomy and that of its member states. And I think the key to building European digital sovereignty is to adopt a comprehensive vision of digital technologies, to understand that each technology or service is actually part of a whole digital architecture. And that to be able to control this technology or service, we also need to control the other technologies, infrastructures, or equipment on which it relies. And if we consider AI, for instance, AI relies on the data provided by platforms and apps, and it also relies on the computing power and storage capacity of cloud computing. And cloud computing relies on data centers connected to each other and to the World Wide Web through networks. And data flows thanks to connectivity infrastructures, so undersea cables, cell towers, antennas for 4, 5, or 6Gs, etc. And so all these elements function thanks to processors, which are on chips, which themselves depend on the semiconductor industry. So this is just a few examples, but when we think about digital sovereignty, this is the whole supply chain of a digital service that needs to be taken into account. And all these technological sectors are intertwined, and it is only by strengthening European capabilities in each of them that Europe will become more autonomous. And it's a long and costly process, but I think it's an essential step. And some estimates suggest that it would take at least 300 billion euros and maybe 10 years to develop such industrial capabilities. But the idea is not to entirely replace American technological products, and I'm not even sure that it's possible, but it is simply to create robust and viable European alternatives. And at the same time, and this is my third and last point, the EU must develop and strengthen cooperation with other states and organizations. And it is an answer to the question mark, Europe on its own. Because no, the EU is not alone, and the changing geopolitical context, this paradigm shift, is affecting the whole world in all areas, including the digital field. And this could be an opportunity for the EU to get closer to like-minded countries and to join forces and build complementarities in the digital sector. And by diversifying its partnerships, the EU will limit its dependence on the United States, making itself less vulnerable to American pressure. And this is a form of de-risking that complements the strengthening of European capabilities. And the EU currently has 4 digital partnerships with Japan, the Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Canada. And we could also mention the EU-India Trade and Technology Council on these topics. But I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to discuss all of that with you.
Thank you so much, Clotilde. Again, important points about the need to do complex things, expensive things, but necessary things, and there needs some sort of realism. We cannot cut off the US completely, but we do need to do more things on our own and with partners across the globe. So this leads into our Q&A session. We have about 20 minutes, and there's a few questions already. I'm trying to put them together into bundles, and I would like to ask the first question, and these are mostly directed to Stephen, but they could also, other colleagues are welcome to join. They're about basically how the the EU can be a magnet for attraction and for the buildup of new alliances. So on the one hand, how can the EU become a third option as opposed to the United States and China? Resuming a debate that perhaps was that has been for a while, but it is necessary now to show the fact that the EU is not alone. So basically, how can the EU also deal with other groupings? There's a mention of Mercosur, of ASEAN, and a few others. And also there's a question of the other like-minded allies, such as Canada, or there's been also some mentioning about Africa as well. So basically the question is, how do we build the other alliances if we cannot rely anymore on the US?
No, many thanks, Giuseppe. Let's say a few comments on that. Indeed, I think now is the moment for Europe to send a really consistent message to the rest of the world that we are and remain open for business, that we're not falling for this mirage of unilateral protectionism, that we are ready to expand rules-based trade, that we are ready to expand cooperation on digital and other disruptive technologies, as Clotilde just reminded us. We should go out in the world and market the European Union as a reliable partner of people who keep their word. And I think that would resonate very, very well. You mentioned a couple of logical, let's say, targets for such an approach. Let's begin with one ring is the sort of the wider like-minded community. Trump may speculate about a G8. Some of us are speculating about a G6. This is perhaps a moment where we can intensify, as we are, with Canada, with the United Kingdom. This is a sort of a real opportunity to do what I have long believed is a necessary and attractive thing to do, which is to really, strengthen the links between ourselves and Britain in this new context. There's South Korea, there's Japan, there's Australia. I mean, there's the whole wider set of countries that I think are now very, very interested in intensified European cooperation on a wide range of things. But also, let's not box ourselves into this classic category of the like-minded, because you rightly say, you mentioned Africa, I mentioned Mercosur earlier. We, I think, have a unique opportunity to use the year of summits. This year, I don't know if people notice, but this is the year that the European Union will have most summits planned with a largest sum of people around the world, which will present excellent opportunities to develop these kinds of more ambitious partnerships, to finally turn the global gateway from, as the phrase has it, from startup to scale up, but to really have sort of transformative offers to partners in Africa, in Latin America, the SALEC Summit, and so on and so forth. So let's really be smart about this opportunity and substantiate this with tangible offers. Because what partners around the world want to say, okay, what is your offer then? They know about perhaps a Trump approach and real estate offers. They know about a Chinese proposition, but they really want to develop partnerships, I think, with the European Union on more shared wider bargains. Just on China, because I saw also a question on China in the thread. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, it is clear that when Trump too leaves, the Paris Climate Agreement yet again, then we have a clear interest to work with what is the biggest emitter of CO2 emissions, and that is China, and to intensify cooperation on climate change. But I think we should be very clear-eyed about how we approach China. It will be a mistake to now somehow try to get closer to China and to ignore some of the obstacles that have really prevented EU-China relations from further. And what are these obstacles? They are, overcapacities. They are elements of economic coercion. They are to do with a worsening human rights record. All these things are still there today, and we should not forget about that. So in some specific fields, for sure, we can work more with China, but we should not ignore the very deep and underlying difficulties that have bedeviled EU-China relations. Let me stop right there and hand back to you.
Thank you. And this is an excellent segue into the next batch of questions that I've collected, which were about China specifically. And these I will direct to both Andre and Clotilde, actually. So since you, Stephen, already set the stage to say, you know, be careful about engagement with China and just jumping back from away from the US all the way in from China and forgetting all that we have done in these years to de-risk from China and realizing that there was a reason behind that. So if I can put it to our other two analysts, Andre, perhaps here there's as usual siren calls of China becoming some sort of mediator in Ukraine, once again resurfacing or playing a role there. So how do you assess that also in light of the continued relationship between China and Russia? And then I will ask then Clotilde to follow up with the questions on tech dependencies on China and how and you know parts of the supply chain dependencies, how realistically we can move away from the US while at the same time keeping the risking from China.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. I will be very telegraphic. I think when it comes to mediation, I think we need to recognize that China is perhaps formally neutral in the conflict, but in practice it is not. It has provided substantial support to Russia's war-making effort. With its clear limitations and the partnership between Russia and China has its clear limitations, which we need to recognize and perhaps even seek to exploit, but not realistically by driving a wedge between Russia and China. And here I just perhaps make a footnote on this kind of idea which gets a lot of traction in the Beltway in the U.S. administration. Nixon reversed. The conditions are completely different. This is not the 1960s. Russia or Soviet Union and China war, 1969, the dramatic deterioration of the relations, which all paved the way for Mr. Kissinger going to Beijing and ultimately Nixon as well. So it's a highly misleading historical analogy in my view. The second point is that my assessment is that the current regime in Russia sees itself and Russia as being in a conflict with the collective West. Of course, we see a lot of very dynamic developments here, but my assessment is that they see Russia's interest and the US interest as fundamentally different. Of course, they will opportunistically exploit the current situation, but as I mentioned before, they are skeptical about this sort of grand rapprochement, and a broad deal on many things with the United States. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Clotilde, if you want to follow up.
Well, thank you, Giuseppe. Right, indeed. I think Europe's dependencies on China are indeed a topic of of worry, but not as much as the US, because definitely the Europe's dependency is much bigger on the US than on China. But we should still be careful, and I think let's not go towards Chinese solutions, tech solutions, and this is something that we've seen with very heated debates. A few years ago, I think it was in 2020, when we had these debates about 5G's antennas in Europe, and we saw how divided Europe were about Chinese equipment. I think on the cloud computing sector, China could also, well, it is the sole competitor and potential challenger to the US in this sector as well. But I think that I've seen many unwillingness from European countries to go there on cloud computing as well. And especially towards Huawei, Alibaba, or these providers which are Chinese. And so I think on the European side, we should definitely not change our positions on China, even if it means going in the same direction as the US. And I'm thinking about, for instance, export controls when it comes to semiconductors. And I think we should definitely support and enforce the current US export controls on semiconductors, and not forget that this global tech race is happening between Washington and Beijing, but we're in the middle as European, and we definitely need to open this alternative for ourselves, but also for our partners, because there is definitely a demand from other countries for technologies that are neither developed by this US oligopoly, but not also from Chinese companies with Chinese biases, I would say, including them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Clotilde and Andre. Now, the next batch of questions that I've seen are on the element of European defense budget and enablers and so on. So I'll try to answer this. I may ask Stephen to jump in and as well. So the first question is on how realistically can Europeans develop these strategic enablers, which, by the way, to clarify, strategic enablers are elements of an armed force that allow to carry out battlefield operations. So they are not used to shoot, put it crudely, but they are used to enable other parts of the armed forces to shoot. And the question is how long it will take to develop. So in fact, European armies have been developed for 70 years, according to the NATO defense planning model, according to the NATO plan. So in an unallied format. And the reason is that every army would provide something and not the entirety of the force. So you could have specialization. Specifically the US, being the biggest force, has provided these enablers, which allowed command and control from above, air defenses, long-range strikes to protect the battlefield, and suppression of enemy air defenses, but also in more recent terms, electronic warfare capabilities, which we heard to be so important in a context such as Ukraine, where there are drones all around and there's jamming and counter jamming and so on. So all these are relevant, and of course, intelligence, security, reconnaissance that we've seen. So in all this, the Europeans have less or nothing compared to the US. How quickly can they be in place? Now, there was a recent survey of experts, defense experts, who were asked to say how long it will take. And on some areas, on some enablers, Europe can achieve self-sufficiency in a few years, 3 to 5 years, which is actually a short time. Let's remember that in defense, the unit of measurement is decades, is not years, is not months, it's decades. So 3 to 5 years is not bad. So in areas such as battlefield command and control, or long-range strikes, or suppression of enemy air defenses, which basically allows your forces not to be shot down or attacked while they perform operations, the Europeans have things that they can expand. Even in terms of satellite communications, the EU has satellites, but they're used for civilian purposes. So there the questions become political. Can you use them for military purposes? On other areas, such as Andre mentioned, Starlink, intelligence gathering, ISR from space, and so on, we're far away. We mostly rely on the US. This means that it will take much longer. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We should start working on it. As we said, decades is the unit of measurement. But in the meanwhile, of course, there's still needs for dependency on the US. That's how we were built to fight, and that's how we should try as much as possible to fight. This sort of leads into the question of whether NATO should function, continue functioning. And there, I would say that NATO is both the transatlantic link, which is at risk, but it's also an integrated command structure. And in that latter sense, it is helpful to keep having it. Of course, without the US trying to replace US elements if needed, which is expensive, but it's, we should not discard it immediately. Which leads to the other question about spending and budgets. The question is, how can the European publics be persuaded to follow the Rearm Europe plan? I would like Stephen to weigh in on this one. I have some thoughts myself if needed later, but of course, Stephen, for instance, I've read that, not to single out a specific country, but the Netherlands has voted on something that on the Rearm Europe plan that was not as supportive as one imagines. So what are the issues there?
No, absolutely. Just to say, I thought you explained very well, the different components and the different steps and the different timelines that are needed to enable Europeans to be more self-sufficient in these fields of strategic enablers. And the sort of phrase that runs through my head about this whole topic of how fast can we get there and how to think about that. There's this saying, the best moment to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best moment is today. And this is how I feel a little bit the discussion around European defense and strategic autonomy and all the rest of it is. Yes, it would have been helpful had we done some of this work years ago, and some of us were writing about it or working on these issues. But now we have to, and as you also explained, I mean, there are solutions available. I want to convey this sense that we should not slip into sort of a fatalism, that all this is too difficult, all this is too expensive, all this cannot be done. And that leads me then to your point about, European public support. And I think that there is among European publics quite an awareness of how, significant the deterioration of the threat landscape is. People feel scared. I mean, there's a degree of fear in the air across Europe, and they look for people to protect them. And of course, people also are attached to social security spending and, all sorts of other things. So yes, this is politics. But I like to refer also to a country like Denmark, which has been very transatlantic in its outlook and has always prioritized NATO, but is also a very frugal country historically. And there you have a prime minister who goes out and says, in a world of Putin, Xi, and Trump, there's only the European Union as your safe harbor. And you need to invest in the European Union. And if that takes a bigger EU budget, so be it. If that takes a bigger Danish contribution to the bigger EU budget, so be it. If that takes Euro bonds for defense, so be it. So I think the Netherlands, a country I know well, should look a little bit to the Denmark and look for inspiration there, because I think that prime minister has understood that. So you need to invest in your own security. Security is the basis of everything. And that comes with a certain cost. In view of the time, if you allow me, Giuseppe, I saw two questions I wanted to say something very briefly on. One was a question on, should we have sort of a more aggressive actions by our intelligence services inside Russia? Because, Russia is doing all sorts of stuff inside our societies. And look, it's a dilemma. I really recognize the dilemma, because we are, open societies. We are ruled rightly by the rule of law and democratic oversight of intelligence services and what have you. But I think it would be good if intelligence services spoke more about what they do to the public. Because, as I mentioned earlier, people are scared and they want to be protected. And perhaps it would help also the broader effort of strengthening Europe's security and defense posture if we knew more about some of the things that our intelligence services are doing. And certainly all of us have to become a bit more Finnish. When the Finns saw the Russian ships cutting the cables, they not only took action and tried to repair the cable, they impounded the ship, they arrested the crew, and they found that the ship was full of espionage equipment, and they take a more robust action in that sense. And lastly, quickly, was a question also, it's interesting to what's happening in the financial markets. Stock markets are down in the United States, much more than in Europe, by the way. There was first a Trump bounce, and now the NASDAQ is about 7-8% below the level of the moment when Trump got elected. So all good for the tech brothers that supported Trump. Their gains have evaporated. But it's also what's happening on the dollar. It's interesting to keep an eye on that, because the dollar has for decades been the global reserve currency, the sort of the sun, the epicenter around which the global monetary system is structured. And you see that position of the dollar hegemony is under threat as well. And that has certain ramifications also in the geopolitical realm. Because, and I'd be very quick, countries essentially bought F-35s and they held a lot of dollars in their reserves, in the central bank reserves, also so that Uncle Sam would rescue them. would support them if threats were to arrive. Now, if this security protection by the United States is less guaranteed, would countries continue to hold these significant volumes of dollars? That's a big question. So back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Again, lots of interesting points. Would be great to continue talking for hours about it, but we have reached our time. And of course, for all the other questions, you can reach us at the UISS. We'll be happy to continue the conversation. What's important from this discussion, to sum up, is that the issues are extremely urgent. We no longer have the same ally as before. We need to act, indeed, as the tree metaphor is very interesting. Now, better than never. We need to keep a balance. Not everything will change overnight, but there are ways in which we can make ourselves and our immediate neighborhood secure. So let's get on with it. And that's what the UISS will try to continue to persuade our policymakers about. We will conclude now. Thank you so much to all the people who attended, and to my 3 colleagues for participating, and see you next time for another UISS event.